Hello and welcome everyone to our Wellness Matters talk this evening on setting boundaries and regaining control. My name is Nicole Ingrund and I'm the owner and director of River's Edge Counseling Center. And this talk is part of a series of talks that we do a couple of times a month, our Wellness Matters series. And if you were to go to our website and look at the blog section, you'll be able to watch 60 or so pre-recorded webinars that we have done over the past couple of years. And this is our last one of this spring series. And in a couple of weeks or so, we're going to post the schedule for fall. So I invite you to go to the events page of the website, and you'll see them all listed there, and you're always welcome to join us. Our speaker this evening is Allison, and Allison is a graduate practicum student at River's Edge. We've been fortunate enough to have her since September. She just completed her master's degree in counseling psychology at Yorkville University. So congratulations again, Allison, such a huge milestone. And Allison is originally from Montreal, where she previously obtained her bachelor's degree in psychology at Concordia University. Allison has 10 years of experience working in the mental health field and is currently working as a behavioral health consultant, offering cognitive behavioral strategies to patients who are struggling with mental health issues, including anxiety and depression. Outside of work and practicum, Allison spends most of her time with her husband and her dog. She and her little family spend most of their time camping, hiking, running, and enjoying the outdoors. Allison thinks that her webinar might last about 40 minutes or so, and that will leave us a bit of time at the end of the hour for questions. I am going to be keeping my eye on the chat as the webinar continues, and I'll be here if there's any technical problems or anything. You're welcome to make comments, to add some questions for later. You can also use the Q&A function at the bottom. And at the end of the webinar, I'll share some of the comments and questions, and we can have a bit of discussion that way. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Allison.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you for the introduction. So let's get this screen shared. Okay. So welcome everyone. Thanks for attending today. So today, of course, we're going to be exploring boundaries and how do we start setting them and start feeling like we have a bit more control in our lives. So before we get into the presentation, what we'll do is just quickly review the outline for today. So we're going to start off by just quickly looking at some definitions of boundaries, and then we're going to talk about the different types and structures of boundaries that exist. And then we're going to go over boundary violations, what they look like. We'll talk about obstacles in setting boundaries, and what happens when they set us back a bit in our boundary making. And we'll talk about some of the reasons why boundaries are formed. And then we'll talk about how do we start creating them and how do we start feeling like we're a bit in control again. Okay, so what is a boundary? A boundary refers literally to a line that marks a particular area. So boundaries are the edge territory of what belongs to us and what belongs to someone else. Boundaries are not simply just the hard no's, they're also the maybes and the yeses with limits. So for example, please knock on my door before coming into my room. Or I'm not sure if I want to attend that event. Let me see if I feel better by Friday. A boundary is a limit or space between you and the other person. It's a clear space where you begin and the other person ends. Boundaries are not stagnant, so they definitely change over time across situations and within relationships. Boundaries are definitely not clear-cut. They're complicated and definitely difficult. Brené Brown had a really simple way of defining boundaries. It's what's okay and what's not okay. So what is a healthy boundary? This is probably a question a lot of us have. Um, Boundaries are what happen when we can sense ourselves and what we need and want, and we're able to access a voice to be able to speak to those things. So it's just the ability to understand like what we need, understand like that sensation of yourself, understand what we want, and the ability to really access all of that and communicate it to someone else. We all have limits and we all experience violations of our limits. Most of the time, people are not trying to violate your limits. They just aren't aware of what they are sometimes. Sometimes this is because we're not clear with others about our boundaries, and sometimes it's because we're not clear with ourselves what our boundaries are or should be. So I'll probably say this a few times, but boundaries are not easy. They do not come naturally to humans. We'll talk a little bit more about why that is later. But we're not comfortable setting boundaries. We care a lot about what other people think. We want others, of course, to like us. We're afraid that others won't like us. But boundaries are really the key to self-love and the key to treating others with that love and kindness. And of course, the ultimate goal is to protect yourself and take good care of you. So what are the types of boundaries? So there's 7 different types of boundaries. A physical boundary typically deals with pragmatics of touch. So the when, where, how, who, both of touching you and touching someone else. Physical boundaries include the need for personal space, your comfort with touch, and physical needs can also include rest, eating food, the need for water, that kind of stuff. An example of a healthy physical boundary can be, I'm really tired. I think I just need to sit down right now. Or I'm not a big hugger. I'm a handshake person. Or even, no, I don't want you to touch me like that. A property boundary deals with the things that we own or lay claim to. So this can include our homes, our bikes, favorite t-shirts, objects that we own. Our primal brains can get us a bit in trouble when it comes to property boundaries because humans definitely have territorial issues. We also have sexual boundaries, which include both physical and emotional aspect of sex. They also include information about our sexual selves. So who we like, what we like to do with the people we like, and more. And then emotional relational, this one's probably one of the more common ones we hear about. So emotional relational isn't just about how we want to feel and how others want to feel. It's even more so about how we demonstrate our respect for our own personhood and the personhood of others. We respect these boundaries through how we care for others and by letting them have their own emotional experiences. And importantly, emotional relational boundaries are not about taking responsibility for others' emotions, although we're all guilty of doing that sometimes. Emotional boundaries are all about respecting and honoring feelings and energy. Setting emotional boundaries means recognizing how much emotional energy you're capable of taking in, knowing when to share and when not to share, and limiting emotional sharing with people who respond poorly. Respecting emotional boundaries means validating the feelings of others and making sure that you respect their ability to take in that emotional information. So some examples of a healthy emotional boundary setting can be, I really can't talk right now. This isn't the right time. Or I'm so sorry you're having a hard time right now. I'm just not in the place to take in all this information. Do you think we can come back to this conversation at a later date? Just gonna fill my physical need right now of water. And then we're gonna go and talk about the remaining 3 types of boundaries. We've got the intellectual boundary, which includes our thoughts, our beliefs, and ideas, and how they're respected. It also includes our access to information, ideas, and our opportunities to learn. Healthy intellectual boundaries include respect for the ideas of other people, and they can often be violated when our thoughts and curiosities are shut down, dismissed, or belittled. So some examples of intellectual boundaries can include, I know we disagree, but I'm not going to let you belittle me like that. Or, I can respect that we have different opinions on this. A spiritual boundary includes our belief systems, how we practice them, and what we choose to share around those beliefs. Spiritual boundaries are different from intellectual boundaries because spirituality is our human experience with purposeful belonging. It's more of a self in relation to something bigger than our own emotional and intellectual experiences. And this can be a point of bigger vulnerability for people. So examples of a spiritual boundary violation can be, forcing someone to pray who doesn't want to, forcing someone to read the Bible who doesn't want to, or maybe even not letting someone pray who does want to pray. And the final type of boundary, definitely not the smallest one for sure, is time. Time boundaries involve one of our most precious resources, the expenditure of our minutes, hours, and our days. Our time is valuable, and it's important to protect how it's utilized. Setting time boundaries is incredibly important at home, work, and socially. Setting time boundaries means understanding what your priorities are and setting enough time aside for the many areas of your life without overcommitting yourself. When we understand our priorities, it's a much easier thing to do to limit the amount of time that you're giving to other people. So some healthy time boundaries can sound like, I can only stay for an hour, or, I'd love to help, but I think I'd be overcommitting myself. Is there another time? So those are the 7 different types of boundaries that we all have, and all of us have different types, different kind of styles. We'll talk about the different structures that we have within these types of boundaries. So these are the different structures of our boundaries. So we've got rigid, we have permeable, flexible, and we can also have non-existent boundaries. A rigid boundary is typically a boundary where nothing can get through. There's pretty much no space for negotiation. Some boundaries should be rigid, especially if they're there to protect your safety and security. A rigid boundary is normally a boundary that's based on, a need rather than a want. And some rigid boundaries will apply to everyone, whereas others might be more unique to individuals' needs and experiences. A permeable boundary is one that things can get through. For example, if I let my phone ring and have long, drawn-out conversations with people way past my bedtime, my boundary is pretty permeable. In other words, I'm letting people do whatever they want in this situation. My boundaries are permeable to others' wants and needs, and not so much recognizing my own wants and needs in the situation. Non-existent, it's in the word, it's difficulty understanding boundaries that are defined for yourself and for others, and it's just really hard to control how we let things in and how we kind of control our own boundaries for ourselves. Flexible is also known as the healthy boundary, the one that is the attainable one that all of us kind of want to always try to get to. It's that middle ground in which we should operate from for most of our boundary situations. A flexible boundary is a boundary that comes from listening to that internal voice that wants to protect us and wants us to experience growth. It's the internal voice that is continuously addressing and calibrating our boundaries and our needs. So whether a boundary is rigid, permeable, or flexible, Most boundaries are not universal. Individuals have unique needs, wants, and experiences, which really influences what is the right boundary for us. Our boundaries also vary and change depending on relationships, circumstances, and different periods in our lives. So, for example, an overly rigid boundary can be a response to a past experience, maybe a bad relationship, some kind of traumatic event. It can result in a form of an overcorrection of a boundary that may have been too permeable in the past. So, overly rigid boundaries give us a sense of safety and that security that we're looking for in the short term, because they help shield us from situations that are scary and overwhelming. But that's not the point of a boundary. Boundaries are really designed to provide us with safe passage through life, not as a mechanism to control every situation or interaction that we have. So all boundaries really need some sense of flexibility. There should be room for the capacity to negotiate while still maintaining that sense of safety that we need, and also make sure that we're not being taken advantage of. So here is just a really simple look at some of the common traits that we see with different structures of and different types of boundaries. So if we have a rigid boundary style, you might notice that you're avoiding the intimate relationships, close relationships. You might have few close relationships. You might be really protective of your personal information. You might keep others at a distance and avoid that possibility of rejection. That's a big fear for those rigid boundaries. Porous is also permeable. So that's when, you might notice there's oversharing of personal information. It's really hard to say no to others. You fear rejection if you don't go along with what others want to do. And then we've got the healthy boundaries, so the flexible boundaries. This is basically when you start noticing they're valuing their own opinion. They're not compromising their own values for others. They share information, but they do it in a way that's appropriate. So not oversharing, not undersharing. Again, that balance in between. And of course, they accept when others say no to them. That's a big one. So what we'll do here is just a really quick grounding break. Discussing and unpacking our own boundaries and our experiences with boundaries can be really difficult. Reviewing all the different types and structures of boundaries, it can make us start to wonder about our own boundaries and whether or not we've had or whether we have unhealthy or healthy boundaries. This can be pretty activating because it can make us feel like maybe we've done something wrong or that we've made mistakes. So an important thing to remember during this presentation is that everyone here today, everyone in the entire world has definitely had at least one moment in their lives where they've had a difficult time with boundaries. It's pretty common. Some of us have had maybe one instance where we've been overly rigid, maybe one time where we've been overly permeable, and sometimes even non-existent, right? So just keeping that in mind that it's a pretty common human experience. And there's also quite a few of us who have also experienced boundary violations, whether it be a physical boundary violation, emotional, any of the above. So because our brains often will take us to the past, especially when we're talking about something that seems to kind of resonate with us, it's helpful to always bring ourselves back to the present with a grounding exercise. So we want to focus on what's happening in the present, not what we should have done maybe a few years ago. So while we're here, we can take a minute to create a grounding statement for ourselves. So if you want to get a pen and paper out, maybe just have your phone handy, whatever feels right for you, or just follow along. It's totally up to you. Maybe even just keeping a mental note of something that comes up for you. But what a grounding statement is just a reminder that we're in the present and that we're doing important work. So a good example that I'd probably use just based on my own experiences with this kind of stuff, is I'd say, you know, this presentation is a learning experience. This is not about me. This is about me learning about boundaries. So removing yourself from it and just allowing yourself to be present with the presentation. Another way that you could create a grounding statement would be, you know, these are only thoughts or memories. These thoughts and memories might be uncomfortable. They just can't hurt me and they have no place here. Another one we already kind of talked about, you could also say, you know, I'm not alone in my boundary struggle. It's a pretty common human experience. So just taking some time to write down something that feels right to you in this moment, a grounding statement that brings you back to the present. Um, if you've noticed that your thoughts are bringing you to these different moments where maybe you've made a mistake or maybe someone has done you wrong, bringing yourself back to this present moment, make a mental note, write it down, and repeat this statement if you need during this talk. Okay. Then what we'll talk about now is boundary violations. So what boundary violations look like. So boundaries, of course, are the constructs that differentiate us from someone else. Boundary violations are kind of what happens when that space that differentiate us from others is not negotiated in conscious and mindful ways. And that can result in harm. So it kind of all boils down to consent. Really, a lot of boundaries have to do with that. And consent is the informed, voluntary permission given or agreement reached for an activity or exchange between two or more sentient beings. So Pia Melody, who's the author of Facing Codependence, she splits boundary violations into two main categories. So we've got the external boundary violations. That's kind of when, you know, people do something to you in a physical way without your consent. So touching you without your permission, taking something from you without your permission. And then we've got the internal boundary violations, when people violate your emotional space and try to get you to change your behavior and actions to suit their needs. This can be quite manipulative. So some examples of external boundary violations: unwanted touch, entering someone's living space without their consent, maybe using another person's property without their consent, or even smoking in front of others or in their living space without their consent. We've also got some examples of internal boundary violations that can look like asking personal questions outside the depth of a relationship, or listening to phone conversations of others, reading someone else's diary, letters, text messages, emails, assuming the feelings of others, assuming the others' behaviors, assuming others' thoughts, treating someone in a condescending way. So those are some of the examples of those internal boundary violations. So here are some of the obstacles to boundaries. A pretty common misconception to boundaries is that when we're making boundaries, we believe that we have to be mean to others in order to do so. That's a pretty common misconception. Another common misconception is that in setting boundaries, we feel like we might do harm to the relationship. And another obstacle that we often see is this overwhelming sense of guilt that we get when we're setting boundaries with other people. So the first obstacle, setting boundaries means that you're mean. So there is a pretty common connection between the word yes and being kind, and the word no and being mean or unkind or hateful. It's a pretty common connection that we have in our brains. But it is possible to say no with love and yes with hate, distaste, or unkindness. So what we have here is a chart called the way of being. And if we look at it, we can see the top left corner, the soft, loving corner. Those are the behaviors, soft, loving corner, sorry. Those are the behaviors that we typically kind of all think of that are the good ones, right? So those are often coming from loving, selfless intention. We're saying yes because we're being selfless and we just want to make sure that, we're showing our love and our kindness to others. The bottom left corner, hard, selfish, or bottom right corner, is a way that a lot of us see saying no. So that's kind of that stereotypical, that misconception that we have, right? So no means that you're aggressive, so screaming, yelling, trying to force someone to change, you're mean or even violent, right? So the physical violence piece. Then if we take a look at the top right corner, the soft selfish, we can see that when you do say yes, you can actually have some selfish intentions behind that yes. So for example, a parent who doesn't want to deal with their kid anymore and says yes to the child just because it benefits the parent. And I'm sure a lot of us are guilty. I'm not a parent myself, but I know lots of parents, and I'm sure this is definitely something that we're all guilty of. But this yes is coming from a selfish intention. We're doing it because we just can't deal with it anymore, right? So we're kind of giving in. And then the hard loving corner is saying no with loving intention. So again, that's that no, but there's love behind it. There's some purpose, there's kindness behind that no. So saying no can be a good thing for someone else and an honest and loving thing for ourselves. So that kind of sort of, I guess, is a way to think about boundaries and think to yourself, okay, am I saying no? Does it mean that I'm being mean? Maybe not. Maybe saying no is actually a good thing for the other person and also for you. Obstacle number 2, boundaries can hurt relationships. So obviously another fear that we have is if we establish the relationship, we're going to hurt the relation, or if we establish the boundary, we're going to hurt the relationship. So humans really have an instinctual need for connection. It's really ingrained in us. So any sort of interruption to that connection can be quite daunting. Because we have this instinctual desire for connection, boundaries are pretty much the opposite of what we're programmed to do. So no wonder they're pretty hard. When we feel like we got to start creating those boundaries, it's the opposite of that programming that we have. And this can actually lead to, feelings of anxiety, some pretty strong fear that might happen, even the sense of loss. And this will definitely perpetuate that cycle of those unhealthy boundaries because that's just an uncomfortable way to feel. The problem is when it comes to this is that in striving to protect the relationships that we have and the attachments that we have, we often forget about ourselves. And the last obstacle is guilt. So this one's a pretty common one that I've heard and that I've also experienced myself. So psychology today defines guilt as aversive. And like shame, embarrassment, or pride, has been described as a self-conscious emotion involving reflection on oneself. People may feel guilt for a variety of reasons, including acts that they have committed or think they've committed, a failure to do something they should have done, or thoughts that they think they're morally wrong. So feelings of guilt have a lot to do with our belief system and our values, our core values. If we believe it is important to put others' needs before ours, we will feel guilty if we feel like we're placing our needs before someone else. Similar to a value, if we value family and putting family first, and we interfere with that value by putting family second, there's going to be a conflict there and we're going to feel guilty. We would all probably benefit in recognizing how guilt has trapped us. It inhibits us from setting boundaries in our relationships. The main intention behind feeling guilty is a good one. It's to live life in the right direction. But sometimes all it really does is damage your relationships and keep you from being your own person. So of course, we're talking about boundaries and all these obstacles. It's important to mention culture when we talk about this, because everyone's experience with boundaries is going to be different based on the culture and the background that they come from. So we're from Canada's westernized culture, very much focused on that individualistic viewpoint. We prioritize the setting or the importance of setting healthy boundaries. Boundaries are very important in an individualistic sense. But what we deem to be healthy is going to be very different from cultures who view boundaries differently. In collectivistic cultures, family members identify closely with one another and often make decisions for the family as a whole rather than for the self. So sacrifice, honor, loyalty, these are some of the core values of these families and cultures. So for example, saying no to a family or setting limits on simple family events or dinners can actually be perceived as selfish and rude. And so it can be pretty tricky to navigate boundaries depending on, that collectivistic sort of cultural component that might make boundaries even a little bit harder. It's important to always keep this in mind as we continue through this discussion on boundaries. So how are boundaries formed? There are a lot of ways in which boundaries are formed. So, social norms, social cues, societal expectations, there's lots to name. I don't have enough time to go over all of them today, but one of the main foundations to boundary formations is our attachment styles. So we really are a product of our experiences, and this is it's not any different for our boundaries, right? So an attachment style is basically the dynamics of how we navigate our interpersonal relationships. For a lot of people, early childhood attachment styles affect their later relationships and how they recognize and establish boundaries with friends, families, and partners. So there's 3 different types of attachment styles. We've got secure attachment, avoidant attachment, and anxious attachment. So secure attachment is when people feel generally pretty comfortable with others. Someone with secure attachment is going to feel safe depending on others, and others can depend on them. There isn't a constant or periodic fear of abandonment with someone who has secure attachment. There isn't a fear that someone will get too close. Life isn't too scary with someone who has secure attachment. So they tend to develop with more of a healthy, flexible boundary. An avoidant attachment generally involves people who have a hard time trusting or depending on others and are generally uncomfortable with the level of closeness that others want from them. Their life experiences result in the development of rigid boundaries. Anxious attachment often worry about whether people will love them or want to be with them, or that they're going to scare a partner, friend, or loved one away. There is often this craving for closeness that is not attainable. Anxious attachments have more permeable, sometimes non-existent boundaries. Often, because of this, they try to please others, but in the process, they're often taken advantage of. So similar to boundaries, attachment styles are not clear-cut. Often people will have a combination of attachment styles. So looking at this little diagram here, having the secure but also low avoidance, right? So it definitely, there can be more than one. We can be secure avoidant, anxious secure, that kind of stuff. Um, so attachment styles will change according to situations. Um, Sometimes it can feel like maybe we're overly rigid in one situation, and then in another, it might feel like we're overly permeable. It really depends on which of our attachment issues is being activated in any given situation. So it really depends on what's being activated. So research does show that our attachment style as children does play a moderate role in our attachment style as an adult. So moderate being the key. We react based on our past experiences until we can start gaining awareness of what's going on, and we can learn different ways of approaching our interactions with others. The kinds of relationships we have can also really reinforce or rewire these attachment styles. So depending on the relationships we have, can make it worse, better, really depends. So why should we create boundaries? What are some of the benefits to boundaries? So in creating healthy boundaries, we'll notice that we have, a good self-esteem, it gets better, our self-respect increases. We're going to notice that we're going to be able to share personal information gradually in a mutual sharing and trusting relationship. We're going to notice that we can share physical and emotional space, or protect emotional space from intrusion. We're going to notice that we can have an equal partnership where responsibility and power are shared. We're going to notice that we can be assertive. This is something we'll talk about later. We can confidently and truthfully say yes or no, and be okay when others say no to you. We'll be able to separate our needs, thoughts, feelings, and desires from others, and recognize that our boundaries and needs are different from others. And lastly, we'll be able to empower ourselves to make healthy choices and take responsibility for ourselves. Okay, so what are some of the steps to taking these personal boundaries that I keep talking about? Um, we're going to talk about in the next few slides how to start recognizing your own boundaries, and how do we start beginning to work on them and feeling like we're getting a little bit of we're getting to feel like we have a bit more control over time. So step one, first step is building boundaries is understanding our own boundaries. This is kind of where we have to take the time to listen to ourselves and pay attention to answers or cues that are coming up. So, for example, listening to ourselves in situations. If we're feeling low energy, if we notice, like, hey, like my stomach feels weird, or I'm getting butterflies right now, or maybe even situations where we feel really emotional, just paying attention to picking up on that kind of stuff as it relates to our interactions with others and our boundaries with others. We've all had some struggles in recognizing and communicating our boundaries. Sometimes we weren't aware or weren't paying attention to what was happening. So, this is where that self awareness and paying attention piece is really important. Exploring your own boundaries in a conscious, mindful way. So, this can be done, for example, by looking at the different types of boundaries that are out there. Physical, there's the physical, there's the sexual, there's these different types of boundaries that exist, and exploring which ones kind of stand out to you, and asking yourself which, like, what if that's a physical boundary, is this boundary rigid, is it permeable, is it flexible, and is there anything I want to do with this specific physical boundary that, like, will change this? Do I need to change it? Are there issues with this boundary? So really just taking the time to reflect on that. And this kind of self-reflection can be done a few different ways. It can be done through journaling, talking to friends, talking to loved ones, maybe talking to your therapist if that feels right, and maybe even looking through one of the boundary setting workbooks that are out there, and I'll include those options at the end. So one of the ways that we can start to gain self-awareness is through self-compassion and mindfulness. This is a very quick and easy loving kindness boundary meditation. So we're not going to sit here for 20 minutes, humming and hawing, but it's much more simple, very easy to do. Loving kindness is really all about honoring our desire to be free from suffering. So really see that connection between those boundaries that might be causing us some sort of pain or suffering or discomfort. Self-compassion derives from Buddhism. It's a process of effecting positive change in our lives by being mindful of our own experiences and offering ourselves compassion in these experiences. So for those who want to take part, like similar kind of before, if you've got a pen and paper next to you, great. If you want to take your phone out, get that notepad open, or maybe you just follow along, just make a mental note of this exercise, whatever you feel comfortable in doing. Very short. So what we'll do is we're going to begin by closing your eyes or softening your gaze towards your lap like this. If you feel more comfortable just staring at the screen, do so, whatever feels good. What we're going to do is just take one collective deep breath here. Just kind of do a big inhale, exhale. We're going to ask ourselves a question. What do I need? What do I need in this moment? Allowing whatever comes up to come. If nothing comes, that's okay. This is practice. Nothing's coming up for you right now, and that's maybe what you need. Just kind of reflecting if anything's popping up, kind of sticking with one or two words. And then what we're going to ask ourselves is we're going to say, what do I really need? What do I truly need? Sometimes love might come up, kindness might come up, maybe even physical space. It might be a need that you have right now. So just make note of whatever comes up. Just jot that down, make a mental note, just be curious about it. And then what you do afterwards is we're going to practice a phrase together. You can say a phrase to yourselves. It's going to start off with may I. It's going to feel a little foreign at first. With practice, it's going to feel a little bit more comfortable. So for example, if space was a need that came up for you right now, what you can say to yourself is, may I have space to think, feel, and dream. Or maybe this process was difficult and you need some love and compassion. So what you can say to yourself is, may I offer myself love and compassion during this difficult process. Just taking another second here for those who want to practice the may I phrase. And then we can, if your eyes were closed or if they were softened, just bringing your attention back to the talk. And this is just a really simple way of exploring your needs and boundaries. And as I mentioned earlier in the slide, there are other ways that we can go about doing this. Okay, so step 2 to setting boundaries, figuring out our core values. So as we already talked about, development of self-awareness is essential to figuring out our needs. Core values are also vital. Human needs and core values are fundamental to our sense of well-being. Human needs are commonly associated with the physical, emotional survival pieces, such as the need for health, safety, for connection, whereas core values have a lot to do with meaning, such as the importance of friendship, family, creativity, that kind of stuff. Of course, our needs and our values are going to overlap. Knowing our needs and values also supports our ability to protect, provide for, and motivate ourselves to act in important ways. The boundaries that we set are based in our core needs and core values. So boundaries are the rules that we make for ourselves. What we do, but what do we do, what do we do if we base these rules, decisions, and actions? A lot of it's based on values. When we realize that boundaries have nothing to do with external situations or people, it's a pretty big relief. Instead of focusing on the other person, you start asking what's going on inside. You can ask yourself, how does this connect with my values? What's going on with this boundary, and how is it conflicting with my value? How is this sitting with me? Step 3, how do we discover our voice? So communication. Communication is how we establish the boundaries. We've covered how to explore your boundaries, and now once you kind of find them, how do you communicate them? There's a linguistics theory called Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. It talks a lot about how what we think informs how we speak, which of course that makes sense because it makes sense. But also, it also hypothesizes about how the way we speak starts to change how we think. So understanding our language patterns and making active changes in these language patterns to create better ways to negotiate the world and better ways to recognize, uphold, and communicate our boundaries. So there's 3 different types of communication styles. These are all the ways you might find yourself communicating in different situations with different people. So we all have had these communication styles depending on who we're talking to. So we've got an aggressive communication style. This one tends to be excessively harsh. This may be a go-to communication style for people who have rigid boundaries. We've got passive. Passive is a communication style that tends to be ineffective in helping people protect themselves and hold boundaries. This is often a communication style for people with permeable boundaries. It's a style of communication that often doesn't make needs and wants known. So typically, like we've already talked about, those permeable boundaries, it's more about the other person. And assertive. So this is kind of that sweet spot of communication styles that we most often want. Always keeping in mind that there are situations in which aggressive and passive communication styles will serve us. This type of communication is an indication that the individual has flexible boundaries. Assertive communicators are firm in their belief system and speak in a way that is congruent with their actions, that still respects different viewpoints. So we want to always try to hit that assertive communication style. So how do we do that? Practicing using I statements is a really helpful way to communicate to someone else that you feel your needs are not being met. It's a really helpful formula to always keep in mind when it comes to that assertive communication. I feel, when you, and what I want is. So for example, I feel angry when you take my clothes without my permission. What I want is for you to please ask me before you take anything. So it's all about taking responsibility for your own feelings and actions and clearly communicating your own needs rather than just targeting the person or blaming the person. So you're saying, I feel when you do this, I need you to do this, please. Effective communication is a skill. In order to learn the skill, you do need to practice it until it becomes second nature. Remember that theory we just talked about, how we speak starts to influence how we think. Just a final note that we're really all works in progress. It's important to remember, boundaries take time to figure out. They're definitely not going to happen overnight. So work in progress. And then I'll just quickly share resources. This will be on the website, I believe. Just some resources that are really helpful. And that's it. I'll stop sharing.
Why do I
Oh,
always do
maybe.
that? Leave my, yeah. Oh, that was wonderful. Thank you very much, Allison. I'm just looking to see if there's comments or questions. Feel free to type anything that you'd like. For those of you who can't stay for a bit of conversation, I just want to thank you again for spending a Tuesday evening with us and remind you that you're always welcome to join us for a talk. Okay, we do have a couple of questions. That's wonderful. Someone is saying, with setting boundaries, I've come across people who will consistently push back on them. Is best thing to do is different? Then maybe, so they're saying maybe the communication style was different and they were communicating their boundary in a passive way, and they maybe need to be more assertive. Or maybe communicating it in a more firmer way. Yeah, that can be really challenging sometimes. Yeah.
Definitely. I mean, I guess what I'll definitely say about that is there probably will be pushback. I should have mentioned that part, I guess, because I think you already, Nicole asked that, right? There will be pushback. We have different communication styles and we come from different experiences. But what's really important to remember is what we're doing. Just always bringing it back to like, well, I'm sticking to my core values and my needs. And if that person's not going to respect that, at least I know what I did in the situation. And that's pretty much all you can do.
Great, thank you so much. Someone is saying that you touched on cultural factors when dealing with boundaries, how to balance or create boundaries, specifically time and emotional boundaries, when dealing with elderly parents, frequent care needs, demands, and their cultural non-North American expectations.
Yep, definitely I feel for that. I've heard this quite a few times, which is why I thought it was really important to make note of. Cultural factors do really make things more complicated when it comes to boundaries because, like I already touched on, that collectivistic kind of perspective really does kind of skew our boundary making. So, I mean, what could be helpful is, we're talking about this whole presentation was really based on that individualistic perspective. So maybe toning that down a bit and starting to set small boundaries and just testing the waters and seeing how that works with your elderly parents. So nothing too crazy, like, oh, I'm not coming to this event because, X, Y, and Z, but I can come sometimes and sometimes I can't, right? So just changing it in a really small way to see if you can start kind of testing the waters. Hopefully that's helpful.
Right, thank you. Someone is asking to see the list of books again. So, sorry, I should have mentioned earlier that, and if it's okay with you, Allison, we'll have the presentation, the slides, and then we can put them on the blog post with the video, so you'll be able to check out all of the resources again. Yeah. So
Yeah.
lots of expressions of appreciation here for you, Allison. Appreciate the information. Someone is saying, thank you, great information and presentation, very informative, useful. Someone is saying that they get very nervous when they get into conflict with others. I really resonate with that. And asking, how do I keep my nerves down as I set healthy boundaries? That's a great question.
Yeah. This is the one that I've worked on with clients actually and patients in the past. It's pretty tough. I think, like I said, it's all about like baby steps, so really small steps, not too different from that cultural question too, right? It's just really taking the small steps and not establishing like the big scary boundaries, but maybe just doing small things and seeing sort of how that works for you. And just trying to, just small steps is really the key to it, I think.
Yeah. So I was just thinking about something that's worked for me around that in the past too, is like lots of times we'll talk about mindfulness in terms of how we relate to ourselves. but there's something called interpersonal mindfulness, where you really kind of train yourself and you're intentional in a situation to pay attention to how the other person is responding. So what do they say back to you, their facial expressions. And the reason that that works for me around setting boundaries is because I can catastrophize. And when I get nervous, I can kind of shut down and not pay attention to how people are actually responding to what I'm saying when I'm nervous. And then later, without that information, I catastrophize and fill in a lot of stuff about how uncomfortable that was for the other person or how angry they might be. And sometimes people respond better than you think they will when you're nervous. So it helps me to pay attention to that. Of course, sometimes it does create conflict, and that's hard in a different way too, but I know that's sort of helped me sometimes. Yeah. Someone is saying, this has been very helpful. I found the exercise to figure out what you need really impactful. I actually shed a few tears when I realized what I needed. So thank you so much for that. I'll take that forward with my psychologist. Oh, thanks for that comment. Someone is asking, if you have a boss who expects you to drop everything when she needs you, how to handle that?
Work boundaries are tough. Yeah.
Mhm.
I think work boundaries are really, really difficult because there's always that fear, right? There's definitely that power differential. And there's always a fear of like what could happen if you do set boundaries. Um, yeah, I mean, I guess it's pretty similar to the other answers, but I guess just kind of seeing how you can communicate, like, so that's that formula again, right? So in this moment, like, I need maybe a bit more time on this project, and like just trying to see how you feel in that moment, which saying that, and just like, so if I need this, or I feel this way, and following up with like, is it possible that I have more time, right? So just trying that out and slowly seeing how your boss responds to that. Kind of similar to what Nicole said, that was really helpful advice. We do a lot of the time get in our own head about what are that people that we're speaking to, what their response is going to be. And so if we can just be mindful in the moment and get out of up here and just notice how they're reacting, that can really help establishing boundaries, make it a lot easier.
Someone's asking for the name of the theory. I'm trying to think which theory. What could that be?
I think I know what they're talking about. I'm just going to look at it really quickly because I forget too. It's called the... Where did I put you? It's a tricky one to remember because it's kind of a Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. I believe that's what they're asking about. So that's a theory or linguistics theory that basically it basically says, like, we talk about what we think, of course, right? That makes sense. It's kind of like, yeah, we get that. But also how we speak affects how we think. So that's a lot to do with boundaries, right? So like, that formula that we're talking about, like, I feel this way, or, I need this, will change how you think about things, right? So it's just a little bit of a different way of looking at it.
Thank you. Someone is asking about podcasts that we recommend to learn more about boundaries. By so many of them, it comes up as a topic, but I can't think of one in particular that focuses on it. How about you, Allison?
Yeah, that's a good, I think anything with Brene Brown's probably a good bet. There are some podcasts with Kristen Neff, and she does talk about boundaries as well, but I don't think there's one that specifically talks about boundaries.
Okay. Yeah.
Not that I can think of.
Someone is asking, how does a person tune into themselves when they are accustomed to porous or no boundaries?
That's a really good question. If you feel like, if you're one of those people that's in those permeable or non-existent boundaries, It might just start off by just really simple reflection exercises. The workbook that's in the presentation. There's a few workbooks that are out there that are really great. One, forgive my language, but this is what it's called. It's called Unbeep Your Boundaries. It's fantastic. It really, and it gets you to slowly kind of start really analyzing and reflecting on boundaries that you might not even be aware that you need. So that's just a really kind of nice way to slowly get yourself in the mindset to think about those boundaries that you haven't been used to having.
Thank you. Someone is asking about a recommendation for a therapist. Well, we have about 23 therapists at River's Edge, and we have 5 practicum students like Allison at any given time. And so I really encourage you to look at the team page of our website and read the bios. We always talk about how important having a good fit with the therapist is to really make it worthwhile. So it's hard to make a recommendation without knowing you, but our admin staff is really great at helping people sort through all of the different variables and choose someone who will be helpful for them. And I definitely want to give a shout out to our student program because Allison and our 4 other students currently with us are here until the end of August. And then in September, we'll have 5 new students start, and they're with us for a whole year, and they work on a sliding scale. So that's a really nice and unique option to be able to do long-term counseling at a price you can afford to. So you might even be able to mention that to our admin and take advantage of that. Let me see, I think that comes to the end of our questions. Yeah. Wonderful. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. More information on that, Nicole. Yeah, go to River's Edge about the counseling, go to riversedgecounseling.com. And if you go to the contact page, you'll be able to submit a form and our admin will get back to you, or you can email them or phone them and they'll be happy to fill you in more about that option as well. So thanks, for coming. I hope we'll see some of you again. And again, I'll be posting a recording of this presentation and the slides in the next couple of days if you'd like to look at it again or refer it to someone in your life. We all know someone we'd like to maybe suggest a course about boundaries. Oh, good. Okay, well, have a good night, everyone. Take care. Thanks again, Allison. That's wonderful.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, everyone. Take care.